So welcome to this Bible Talk lecture series on From Magi to Mission. We're on to penultimate one now, we're on to the Passion narrative. And Josie Tuplin is joining us, and I'll leave Liz to introduce her in a second. But first of all, the prayer for St. Matthew's Day. Almighty God, whose blessed Son called Matthew the tax collector to be an apostle and evangelist, give us grace to forsake the selfish pursuit of gain and the possessive love of riches, that we may follow in the way of your Son, Jesus Christ, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
So welcome everyone. Over to you, Liz.
Okay, thank you. So many of you will have come across Josie before, because Josie is a tutor on the reader training course and teaches Old Testament. And I think everybody speaks well of Josie's teaching, but I've known Josie for a long time, because once upon a time she was one of my trainees and was a reader. Now she's curate at Woodchurch parish, so very varied life. And we look forward to what you've got to say to us, Josie.
Thank you. Well, first a disclaimer, I think. I don't actually regard myself as any sort of New Testament scholar. I teach Old Testament to readers and don't even claim to be a scholar of the Old Testament either. And I'm not setting out, I have to tell you, to provide a lot in the way of answers. What I do hope to do is to raise some questions and some lines of inquiry for you. I know for myself as a preacher, it's often the things that puzzle me, the oddities that stick out from a narrative, that provide that spark that can make for such a good sermon. And today we're going to be looking at Matthew's account of the Passion in chapters 26 and 27 of Matthew. And I think the first thing to say is that Matthew's Passion narrative clearly resembles Mark's in terms of content, the order of events, and often the wording. And so if we take the consensus view that Matthew's version is actually based on Mark's, that means that we can say that Matthew's Passion narrative follows Mark's very closely, and I am going to keep saying that. So if you want to take issue with that, we'll talk about that afterwards. And one of the first things to notice is that we can spot Matthew's own Jewishness and the Jewish readers for whom he's writing in some of the changes and the additions he makes to Mark's account. For example, Mark says that it was the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders who plotted to kill Jesus, and then who turned up in the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him. But Matthew omits the scribes from his versions of those events. Scribes only appear in Matthew's account at the emergency meeting of the council in the high priest's house on the night of Jesus' arrest. And I think that's because Matthew knows that the scribes are only lawyers, and it's the chief priests and elders who carry real clout as leaders of the Jewish community. Those lawyers only belong in the court hearing. And I'd also like to say that it's true that not every difference is important. I can't for the life of me think why, in the story of Peter's denial of Jesus, Mark's cockerel crows twice and Matthew has changed it to once. Maybe it's just that Matthew knows more about cockerels than Mark. Maybe he knows that once a cockerel wakes up and crows, he generally doesn't wait very long before he has another cockadoodle. And Mark does cram quite a lot of action into the space between cockadoodle 1 and cockadoodle 2 in his account. So maybe what Matthew's doing here is changing the narrative because he's worried about cockerel-centered narrative implausibility. Who knows? But where there are crucial differences, it's usually because Matthew has added something to Mark's account. And it's those additions I chiefly want to focus on today in order to identify what's distinctive in the Passion, according to Matthew. And this isn't a coherent account of those things. This is several things I've noticed, which are just put together in what I hope is a reasonably rational order. And I'd like to start with one of the most famous additions Matthew makes to Mark's account, and that's the story of the remorse and death of Judas in Matthew 27, 2-5. 3 to 5. In the rest of the gospel tradition, Judas disappears from view when he's betrayed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's a story about his death in Acts 1, but it isn't a story of remorse. So let's look closely at Matthew 27, 3 to 5. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. So Judas admits that he sinned and shed innocent blood. He tries to give back the 30 pieces of silver he's been paid to betray Jesus. When the priests refuse to take it back, he throws it down in the temple and rushes off to kill himself. Matthew paints a vivid picture of remorse and grief. I find it very moving. And I think here Matthew has complicated my relationship with Judas. And I think Matthew's doing something else too. I think he's asking us to consider the stories of Peter and Judas together alongside one another. He interweaves their stories for us and invites us to make comparisons. And by adding the story of Judas' remorse, he invites us also to find parallels between the two, I think. So this is why you need your Bible. We're going to look at how that works on the page. We're going to be looking at what in my Bible is about 4.5 columns of text in which a lot of things happen. But I want to show you how closely this interweaving happens in Matthew 26. So we're going to start in 26, verse 14. This is the point where Judas decides to betray Jesus. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. So having started out with Judas' story, we now turn to Peter's, just a few verses further on, in verses 33 to 35. This is where Jesus foretells Peter's betrayal. So I'm looking at verse 34. Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me." So both betrayals have been set up one after the other. And the scene then moves to the Garden of Gethsemane, where in verse 40, Peter is reprimanded by Jesus for falling asleep. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So you could not stay awake with me 1 hour." So we begin to see Peter's failure being delineated. Then it's back to Judas again, as he betrays Jesus in verses 49 to 50. And look how Jesus speaks to him in verse 50. Here, and only Matthew does this, he calls him friend. It's hetaire in Greek. It's a word that's quite unusual in the Gospels, and Matthew uses it to refer to groups of companions. He uses it to refer to a group of children playing together, to fellow guests at a wedding, and to a group of hired workers. So it means something like comrade, companion, mate, partner. And in fact, what Jesus says to Judas means something like, "Mate, get on with what you're here for." The next thing that happens is that Jesus is arrested and taken to the high priest's house. And the narrative turns back to the Peter story again. So in verses 69 to 74, we have the well-known story of Peter's betrayal of Jesus, which I'm not going to read to you, but I am going to point out verse 75, which is where Peter shows his remorse and weeps bitterly after he hears the cock crow. And almost immediately after that, very early on in chapter 27, starting in verse 3, comes the passage we've looked at already of the remorse and death of Judas. So in the space of one rather packed chapter with lots of events happening, and in the space of 4.5 columns in my Bible, Matthew has presented two parallel stories of failure, with one bit of the story coming hard on the heels of the one before. He begins by telling us how Jesus predicts that both will betray him, then describes both acts of betrayal, and that's followed by the grief and remorse of both men. And another interesting thing is that neither man is mentioned again in the gospel. Judas is dead, obviously, but for Peter, there's no reconciliation with Jesus on the beach, as in John. There's no special message from an angel, as in Mark, and no peace be with you, as in Luke. We don't know what happens when Peter and Jesus meet again after the resurrection for the first time. Peter is there as one of the 11 with Jesus on the mountain at the end of Matthew's gospel, but that's all we know. So what is Matthew doing here? What is Matthew doing with us and the way we read this story? Perhaps he's using these stories to highlight the way Jesus faces death alone apart from the faithful women standing at a distance. Perhaps he's asking us to see Judas afresh in the light of Peter's story. Or maybe it's the other way around, and he's asking us to see Peter afresh in the light of the story of Judas. And as I warned you, I don't have any answers for you, but I do want to point out to the way in which he's constructing this story, the parallels and the possibilities for comparison. And I do want to point you to what I think are some rich areas for reflection. So leaving that, I now want to turn to another addition Matthew makes to Mark's account, and that is the idea of the 30 pieces of silver that Judas is paid by the Jewish authorities, the blood money which he tries to return to them, and which is eventually used to buy the potter's field as a burial space for foreigners. The actual sum that Judas is paid is found only in Matthew. And I don't know about you, but I immediately want to know how much that was. How much did Judas think that Jesus was worth? Well, there are two possibilities and one massive improbability. So I'll get rid of the massive improbability, and I use the word massive advisedly here. I'll get rid of the massive improbability first. And the improbability is that it's 30 talents of silver. Well, that's a huge sum. That's a proper hitman sum. But depending on which sort of talent you're talking about, it's either 600 or 900 kilos of silver. And that's hardly something Judas could have tried to hand to the priest and then thrown on the floor, is it? So more plausibly, it could be 30 shekels. Now, 30 shekels is 4 months' wages for a day labourer. So it's a substantial sum. But by this time, the shekel was a temple currency. It wasn't in general circulation, hence all those money changes that we're told about in the temple courtyard. So perhaps shekels is unlikely. The coin, the silver coin that's in common circulation, which can be spent anywhere, is the denarius. So it's probably 30 denarii, what a labourer would earn in a month, according to Matthew's own evidence. So not a trivial sum in itself, but it's not a lot for a man's life, is it? And in the light of that, I want us to look now at an Old Testament text, which Matthew and his Jewish readers would be familiar with, and which also speaks of 30 pieces of silver. And it's Zechariah 11, verses 12 to 13. And while you're laying your hands on Zechariah 11, I'll just say that this is a fairly enigmatic text from a chapter of Zechariah that seems to be composed of a number of short oracles. And how those oracles relate to one another is unclear. So this is quite a gnomic text. But what we seem to have here, is a shepherd who is being rejected and is being paid, probably being paid off with the wages that he's owed. Wages which he describes ironically as this lordly price at which I was valued by them. I'm sure that's ringing bells already with the Matthew story. So here's Zechariah 12 to 13. I then said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it into the treasury, this lordly price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them into the treasury in the house of the Lord. Well, it's fairly easy, isn't it, to see the connection between this text and the story of Judas throwing the 30 pieces of silver to the ground in the temple. And at the end of his additional material on the death of Judas, Matthew typically states that the buying of the potter's field with the 30 pieces of silver happened in order to fulfill a prophecy. So this is Matthew 27, verses 9 to 10. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. That prophecy attributed to Jeremiah is problematic. No such prophecy is to be found in Jeremiah, though he does, of course, write about the purchase of a field and about potters. But the reference to 30 pieces of silver and the one on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price does, I think, point to Zechariah's rejected and undervalued shepherd. And I wonder if that figure of the rejected, undervalued shepherd is something that helps us to see in Jesus, in the rejected Christ, the good shepherd, the one who's sold for 30 silver denarii. It's a figure, I think, to set aside the idea of the suffering servant that we associate with Jesus in these texts. Before we leave Matthew's account of Judas' remorse and death, I'd just like us to notice the trail of blood and guilt that runs through this passage. So this is 27, 3 to 10. In verses 3 to 4, Judas tries to hand back the guilt he's carrying and the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. Then in verse 4, they refuse to accept it. And later in the story, Pilate will wash his hands of it. Guilt is like a hot potato that no one wants to hang on to in this story. What I'm going to do now is to try to find where Matthew believes the burden of guilt for Jesus' death does come to rest. Well, throughout chapter 26, and we've seen some of this in action, the focus in Matthew is on the role of the chief priests and elders and on Judas. So turning back to chapter 26, in verse 3, it's the chief priests and elders who gather at the house of Caiaphas and conspire to arrest Jesus. And in verses 4 to 5, they offer Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus to them. To betray Jesus to them. And it's Judas who first approaches the chief priests and elders. They don't approach him, he approaches them. And that's something that Matthew highlights by changing Mark's text at this point and putting it in direct speech. What will you give me, Judas asks in verse 15, if I betray him to you? So the focus on chief priests and elders and Judas. And it's the same in 47 to 48. The crowd that comes to arrest Jesus with swords and clubs is sent by the chief priests and the elders. And Judas identifies Jesus to them with a kiss. Everything here is very clear. And one of Matthew's changes to Mark's text, a very subtle one, which I'd never noticed before, comes at the end of the narrative of the hearing before the council in Matthew, and it begins at 26:66. Then the high priest tore his clothes, we have in verse 65, because he hears the blasphemy that Jesus has uttered. And in 66 asks, "What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Mark's version is that they all condemned him, and some went on to abuse him. Luke says the abuse was at the hands of the guards who were holding him. But for Matthew, the blame is shared by all. In verses 67, he says, I think 66 to 67, let me get this right. Yes, 66 to 67. He says that they, that is the matters of the council, condemned him, that's in 66, and spat in his face and struck him, that's in 67. They all take part in the abuse. And I'd just leave you with that thought for a moment. Well, it's clear where Matthew stands in the matter of the guilt of the chief priests and elders. And at the beginning of chapter 27, we learn that they all conferred together and took him to Pilate. And Matthew adds the words, "to bring about his death." So throughout chapter 26 and into chapter 27, Matthew has shown us the treachery of Judas and subtly underlined the collective guilt of all the Jewish leaders. We've also been confronted by the faithlessness of the disciples, who couldn't have saved Jesus, but needn't have deserted and betrayed him. And this is highlighted in all the synoptics by their failure to stay awake in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they're all running away when Jesus is arrested. What Matthew adds, as I've already argued, is a fresh way of looking at the story of Peter denying Christ. I believe Matthew brings this into sharper focus by emphasizing the parallels between Peter's betrayal of Jesus and that of Judas. So by the start of chapter 27, the guilt of the council, of Judas and of the disciples is clear. Jesus is plotted against, betrayed and condemned. Everything now depends on the only person who can have Jesus put to death, and that's Pilate. That hot potato of guilt now rests with Pilate. In the main, Matthew follows Mark's account of the meeting of Jesus and Pilate. It's clear that Pilate has the measure of the chief priests. He understands their motive, and he's clearly looking for some way out of condemning a man he seems to believe is innocent. So he gives the crowd a choice, asking in verse 17, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, who's called the Messiah?" And it's here that Matthew adds the first of three details that highlight what's going on here. In verse 19, in a story found nowhere else in Scripture, Matthew introduces a flashback to a conversation between Pilate and his wife. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." I wonder what your reaction is to that additional detail. Does it make you more sympathetic to Pilate, a man caught up in someone else's argument? Does it make you feel more acutely that Pilate's responsibility to stand up for a man? Does it make you feel more acutely Pilate's responsibility to stand up for a man who has a reason to believe is innocent? Well, what happens, of course, is that Pilate lets the crowd decide not only between Jesus and Barabbas, which is something he's able to do by custom, but also the penalty. Verse 22, Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." And here we need to pause, I think, to reflect that only Pilate can condemn a man to death. The hot potato of guilt has landed fair and square in Pilate's hands. And what does Pilate do? He washes his hands. The one thing everyone knows about Pilate. He washes his hands. And I was surprised to discover that it's a detail that, again, is only in Matthew. There are two additions to Mark's story here that are found nowhere else. Pilate washing his hands, declaring his innocence, and telling the crowd, "See to it yourselves," as though such a thing were actually possible, which it's not. And then he adds, verse 25, "Then the people as a whole answered, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" Someone has finally been found to accept the hot potato of guilt. It's the whole people and their children. And the word that Matthew uses here the word Matthew uses here is translated in the NRSV as the whole people, and it's a disturbing word. It's not the word oklos, the common people, the crowd, that Matthew's been using up to now to describe these people. Now he uses the word laos, the word that means the people as a whole. And in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that we know Matthew used, laos is used for the whole people of God, the nation, the Jews. And I can't begin to tell you the damage this verse that we find only in Matthew has done down the centuries. This is the origin of the idea of the blood curse, the idea of the inherited guilt of the whole Jewish people forever. This is how the Jews come to be seen as Christ killers. Well, we don't believe that now, do we? We agree with Rowan Williams, don't we, that what Matthew thinks the people call down on their heads here is guilt that lasts just 2 generations. That Matthew is thinking of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 as being the fulfillment of this curse, which is on us and our children, not on us and our children and our children's children, which is true. But I don't think it gets to the heart of this problem. Or we could argue that it isn't really a curse. There's no verb to be in the Greek. It just says his blood on us. So you could read it as his blood is on us rather than his blood be on us, as though that makes a difference, which I don't think it does. Or we could do what we usually do and just assume that Matthew says crowd here, as he usually does, instead of what he really says, which is people in the sense of nation. And we could hide behind the mistake we often make, which is saying things like, these are the same people who a few days before were welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem on a donkey and have now turned against him because that's what crowds do. Crowds are fickle, and so are we. We've all heard that sermon and maybe even preached it. Or we can say much more reasonably that this is a different crowd from the pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem who welcomed Jesus with hosannas. They were blow-ins, they were people from elsewhere. But here we have the hardcore Jerusalemites and supporters of the high priest. And all of that I think is true, but does it really help? Or we could face the fact that Matthew here places the blame for Jesus' death on the whole Jewish nation and their children, because none of the individuals who made decisions along the way that led to this moment would hold that guilt. Judas tries to pass it on to the religious leaders. They refuse to accept it. Pilate washes his hands of it. At least Judas and Peter were sorry. Well, I warned you, didn't I, that I wasn't offering you answers, only questions and lines of inquiry. So here's a little something else. I think one of the reasons Matthew seems to have altered and added to Mark's account of the Passion is Christological. It's about showing us who he thinks Jesus is. And I think Matthew's Jesus is very different from Mark's. Matthew's Jesus is, I think, very much in charge. Mark begins his passion narrative in 14:1-2 by describing the chief priests and the scribes as plotting to have Jesus killed. But if we turn to Matthew 26:1, we discover that Jesus knows what will happen even before this plot is hatched. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." And then, and that word then is important, the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." It's clear that Jesus now knows that the time is already spoken of many times to the disciples. That time is now, and he's ready. Before the elders and chief priests have even started to plot, he knows what's going to happen. And in fact, he knows better than they do what's going to happen. They think they're going to put their plan into effect after the festival. But Jesus knows the truth. He tells his disciples, after 2 days, the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. And later, when Jesus is arrested, Matthew adds 2 verses where Jesus speaks of his power and authority and the 12 legions of angels ready to protect him should he choose. This is 26:53. "Do you think that I can't appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" He asks one of his followers who's trying to protect him with a sword. And this is a Jesus whose death unleashes earthquakes and the rising of the dead. You can read that in 27:51 to 54. And again, it's only in Matthew. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. And a quick thought to end with. This part of the story begins and ends with individuals and with ideas of burial. It begins in 26:6-18 with the story of a woman who anoints Jesus for burial, and whose story Jesus tells us will be told forever wherever the good news is proclaimed. And it ends in 27:57-60 with a man Mark calls a respected member of the council, but Matthew simply refers to as a rich man and a disciple. He asks Pilate for Jesus' body, wraps him in fine linen, and places him in his own tomb. And there at the end, in verse 61, are the women, those who have never deserted Jesus and are left at the tomb. We end with individuals who can't save Jesus from death, but who are remembered because they honored him, loved him, and served him.
Thank you very much, Josie. That's really thought-provoking stuff. I wonder whether anyone's got any questions. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes for responses or questions, just to give you a minute to think.
Too much to think about.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And there's a great deal to reflect on in that, and I shall be doing. But I'm just reflecting at the moment on the part that you said, talked about the crowds. It's, calling it upon themselves, and the fact that it was laos, calling it upon the whole people. My poor reflection of that is that maybe they were calling it not just on the Jewish nation, but the whole of humanity, because it was for the whole of humanity that Jesus was there. Now, that's the way that perhaps I look to it now, or try to reconcile it, recognizing, as you said, the dreadful way that has been used as an excuse for all sorts of terrible things to be done to the Jewish people.
I think that is how we like to read it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it makes lots of sense. I think that's how I actually think of these words. But I think we need to be aware, don't we, that underneath this is actually something else.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a word that would be used of wouldn't be used of alien nations in the Old Testament. I think it is very much a word used in the Septuagint for the people of God.
So, again, my thinking there is understanding that Jesus became the representative of Israel.
Yes.
And Israel originally was intended to bring the blessing to the whole world.
Yes.
So yeah, that again, that's
yeah. Oh, I see, exactly. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate way of looking at it. And I think that's the sort of reflection which we need to make when we look at the sort of things that Matthew's doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Very, very helpful points.
Mike.
Yeah.
I was very struck by your identification of how Matthew treats Peter, and I wondered if that might suggest he was associated with the parts of the Jewish Christian faith that didn't seem to accept Peter's leadership, because you can see that contrast in Acts, can't you?
You can, and I think that's that's another of those ways you might dive into those differences. What is it telling us about Matthew and Matthew's church, the people Matthew's writing for? I think there's a lot to glean from these things about that. And again, I'm leaving that up to you, Mike. But yes, that's a really possible line of inquiry, isn't it? Is this something about Matthew? And does it tell us something about his views and his prejudices that he's linking Peter and Judas so closely with? But I think the link is there, and it's for us to delve into it and see what we can find. It looks as though you're going to be delving and finding quite a bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
I love the way that you imaged the guilt being passed on from person to person, and it made me think about what we do and how we celebrate Holy Week and Easter to an extent. And we don't have that problem. What we do is we give it to people. So it depends which gospel we're in at the time. But we like to blame it, don't we? So we blame Judas, or we point out that Peter was an idiot, and we use it to kind of elevate ourselves above those people who were around at the time, rather than think, yeah, I would have done exactly the same, actually.
Yes. Absolutely. And you do find people who sometimes are. I came across a guy who wanted to tell me that there was nothing to be said for the Pharisees, because he wanted to keep that word Pharisee. He wanted to keep it as a blame name.
Yeah.
I was quite worried about his thinking there, because we don't use scribe as a blame name, do we? Or chief priest. We use the one that the Pharisees, who are the ones whose teachings lie at the root of modern Jewish tradition. But so I found that quite disturbing, this idea that we want to blame. We want to blame. And Matthew's taking us through that, I think, in a really interesting and provocative way.
Yeah. Richard. You're muted, Richard.
Can't see you, Richard.
I was just something I noticed before we pointed it about the various different, fact that they're all actually related, the disciples, some way. I wonder how much of the story reflected familial dynamics with this group of people, within the disciples and within the following, if you like.
Well, I'm really sorry, Richard. That was your connection's poor, and I couldn't follow that at all.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Oh
I
dear.
think it's
Did
all
anyone-
or not.
Could you put
Did
it in the
anyone-
chat,
Any of
Richard?
that.
Did anyone get the gist
Sorry?
of that?
Could you put it in the chat so that we can read it?
Yeah.
Thank you. While Richard does that, I'll just tell you one more thing which Matthew adds, and this is in there. It's just a little thing to take away, and this is something that Matthew adds in the story of the Last Supper, and he adds two things. So in Matthew 26:28, he takes Mark's wording, "For this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." And Matthew adds, and no one else does, Matthew adds, for the forgiveness of sins. And then in verse 29, he says, again, he takes Mark's wording, "I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in my Father's kingdom." And Matthew has added the words, "with you." So on Sunday, that's something to think about. Matthew's additions, they're very much part of what we'll be hearing and saying on Sunday morning. Sorry, now Richard, have we got anything in the chat?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Coming.
Do you want to try saying it again, Matthew? Or are you busy typing?
No.
It sometimes works better if he puts his video off so that all the bandwidth is on sound, but I don't know if that would work.
Okay.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Ah, interesting. So I wonder what effect all the familiar linkages that are apparent in these two chapters has on the behavior of the protagonist. The desertion of Jesus by his disciples when their mothers stay loyal. That's a great point, Richard. The women do show rather well in Matthew's account of the Passion as they do in general. I'm fascinated by that. I have no idea, but have you pursued this? Have you been working on this at all?
Not particularly. It's something I've just really noticed.
It's, yes, interesting.
Well,
Just with reading within this course in Matthew deeply, I just how much more is it? Luke had a lot of women in his gospel. It's okay, and the fact that they do to be central to the scene a lot of the time, but they're always there in the background. And I do much that is family is due to these linkages, because I feel kind of you have not heard of his mother. There she's fiction.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it's not. I don't think it's an accident that this chunk begins with a woman and ends with some women, and that women are absent from the rest of the story, apart from Pilate's wife. And Pilate's wife is quite interesting because she comes and says this man is innocent. So I think there's certainly work to be done on the way in which women and the idea that they interact in some way with their sons or whatever in the story, that there's a point being made there is an interesting one. I've no idea, but as I say, over to you. I've been showing you where I think the things that are really Matthew in this text, and what we can And I've been suggesting that you might find ways to explain those or think about those. I'm not preaching to you. I'm not giving you answers. This is fodder. And if you want to do something like it, you can do it. If you want to do it quickly, I don't know. I've got. Oh, ideally you need something. You need something like this. You need one of the ways in which you can see the synoptic gospels or all the gospels. If you've got really good eyesight, I can't read the one whether it's all 4 gospels, but where you get the synoptic gospels side by side, so you can look at the differences. And I got that one's not particularly expensive, unlike the one with John in as well, which helps you to track these things down. I found it a fascinating exercise, and I've got lots of questions that I'm going to be looking at the next time Matthew.
Thank you for today's question, Josie. That's been really, really good and really helpful. And we are on time to finish now, but I think Jane's got some notices, have you?
Well, I need to say, look forward to seeing you for the last one next week, which is Professor David Law from the University of Manchester on the resurrection. That's a good subject to finish with. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week, and then we'll tell you about the series in the summer then. So good to see you all. Have a good week.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's really good. Thank you.